Mornings on 100.3 FM, AM 1490, 25 minutes past the top of the hour. Randy Holhut from the Commons. Hey there. Randy, are you there?
Yes.
Oh, geez, that's weird. I couldn't hear you there for a second. Oh no, the world without Randy. It was a very sad few seconds.
Into the void of nothingness.
Into the void. So just a reminder to listeners, BCTV is here filming this portion of Green Mountain Mornings, and broadcast of Green Mountain Mornings tonight is brought to you by, or sponsored by, Brattleboro Savings and Loan. And actually, I have to say, Randy, I was out in the grocery store the other day buying my groceries, and a gentleman stopped, took one look at me and said, "Oh, it's the radio lady. I see you on TV."
There is a sentence you don't hear very often.
No, it wasn't.
That's the radio lady. I see you on television.
It was pretty brilliant. I had to giggle just a little bit. So tell me, this is an issue that I haven't been following very closely, but there are some towns dealing with law enforcement.
Yeah.
And how do they police their communities? And the whole issue of constables. What's happening there?
Most towns here in Windham County either contract with the state police or the sheriff's departments for the modicum of law enforcement services they need. Technically, if you really want to have somebody that serves warrants, deals with dog issues, or kind of things like that, you can have a constable. But if you want to be a constable, and usually that job involves being dog control officer, you do have to go through a certain amount of training to do this. And you also have to be on call 24/7. Mm-hmm. And you have to do all this on your own dime, for a part-time job.
Right.
Your part-time job that might require you to get rousted out of bed at 2 in the morning because somebody has a dog problem.
Or another little thing like a dead animal on the road, or loud music next door, or yes. So
in the case of Guilford, they haven't been able to find anybody to fill that position of constable/dog control officer. And other small towns are seeing the same thing. I mean, it's kind of related to why volunteer fire departments have such a hard time attracting people to volunteer. Mm-hmm. The amount of training you have to put in to be on a fire department. Now it's not, it's not Joe Rockhead's volunteer fire department anymore. You throw on the boots and the fire coat and drive down the road. No, you have to have training in hazardous material handling and some of the other things.
Right. Yeah, and it's not necessarily training that fire houses can do just on their own anymore either, even though they do a lot of in-house training. So,
and it's become more of an issue, too, because the state police is trying to get out of the local law enforcement business mm-hmm. because of the amount of work they're having to do with major law enforcement. Mm-hmm. The amount of felonies they have to deal with is starting to grow between drugs and capital crimes.
Right.
If you're dealing with those things, you're really not going to go down to Mrs. Brown's house to answer her complaint about the barking dog.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it's just not high on your priority list. So, what Guilford is struggling with this, and they're not alone, what's the next step? I hear that Wilmington and Whitingham, and I think maybe even Dover, definitely are talking about maybe having a combined police force.
That would make sense. I mean, because Wilmington has their force, and Dover has their force. Mm-hmm. And besides Bellows Falls and Brattleboro, they're the only towns in the county with full-time police forces.
Right.
It would make sense to have a regional police force to do that, for the Deerfield Valley, Deerfield Valley PD, I guess you'd call it.
Right, DVPD.
But I don't know if, but there's no provision for that, I guess, in state statute to have a regional police force. It's not the county sheriff or the state police.
Right.
But if you're going to insist upon, and that's been talked about in the legislature, of requiring towns to have a certain level of law enforcement because the state police wants out, you got to be able to give towns an option to figure out a way to pay for it, whether it's having a regional department or sharing a constable or a dog control officer among towns.
Right. Well, with Jeanette White working in the legislature to reform some of the structures around law enforcement, I'm sure this conversation will get a lot of traction in the new biennium, providing we are going through an election that Jeanette White is reelected. There are some contested races, after all. Randy and I are going to head off to break. Here is Natalie Knowles, and we shall return momentarily, so do not touch that dial. Thank you for joining us here on Green Mountain Mornings on 100.3 FM, AM 1490. I'm your host, Olga Peters, 39 minutes past the top of the hour. And welcome back to my guest, Randy Holhut of the Commons. So, Randy, let's talk about dope, man.
Far out.
Is that the lingo the kids are using?
You went up to a little meeting up in the West River Valley discussing the subject of marijuana.
I did.
And the quandary of it being legal, at least in a limited amount, in limited circumstances for limited Vermonters, and what it means for the kiddos.
Right. There were a number of folks who work with young people, including Senator Becca Balint was there, Cassandra Holloway from the Brattleboro Area Prevention Coalition, a couple of people who work in the schools. There was a member of the state police, someone from youth services, and someone from the retreat. And not a very big audience. I was surprised about that. I thought there would be more people turning out. But there were some concerned parents who wanted to know that, what do I do now that this is legal, or to a certain extent? How do I talk to my kids about this? What's the impact on kids if they're regularly using marijuana? That kind of discussion.
Yeah, and that's all. I think the lack of interest in the forum kind of tells you how people feel about it, which is one, either they know that it's nobody knows anything, so I don't need to go to this event, or I know what they're going to say, and I don't need to go to this event from the prevention groups.
Fair enough.
But right now, the marijuana policy is so all over the map. I mean, as far as the federal government's concerned, it's on the same level as heroin and cocaine, and absolutely positively prohibited.
Right.
But at the same time, you're seeing states, at least until the current administration, the federal government saying, okay, well, yeah, you can legalize it, but we're watching you.
Yeah.
And the states that have legalized it, showing that it's possible to do this, make a lot of money for your state treasury, and keep the social impacts down to a minimum. I mean, you talk to police officers, and they would much rather deal with someone who's under the influence of marijuana than alcohol. Alcohol, as we've seen from certain prospective Supreme Court justices, makes people mean.
It can do that, yes.
And make them do things that are kind of risky behaviors and antisocial behaviors. And if you're smoking marijuana, you're pretty much eating Doritos or something.
Or getting a little paranoid. That can happen too.
Yeah, that can happen too. But for the most part, you don't OD on the stuff. You don't get violent behavior on the stuff. The social impacts are much more minimal than, say, America's drug of choice, alcohol, which causes many more deaths and many more social problems. But of course, that's legal.
Right.
It's okay. Oh, I'm so glad little Janie's not smoking dope. She's just only drinking beer. That's okay.
It's legal.
It's legal.
Well, I have to say a couple things did stand out for me at the meeting when I covered it. One was Cassandra Holloway from the Prevention Coalition did talk about how are we going to market marijuana and if we should consider how we market it. Like cigarette companies, remember, they got their wrists slapped years ago for creating spokespeople like Joe Camel that was geared to attracting the attention of children. And I thought that was a really good point, that we do want to be careful about how these products are marketed. The other thing that stood out was, I am forgetting her name at the moment, but she works for the Wyndham Southeast Supervisory Union. Hanako Jones? If I got her name wrong, I apologize. She did talk a lot about the difference between marijuana from the 70s and the 80s, when a lot of the people who are parents now probably smoked it, and what marijuana is like now and how much stronger the different components and chemicals in it are. And I thought that's something that I think parents really probably need to hear, because if they're assuming that they and or their kids have access to what they had access to in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it's just not the same product anymore.
Well, this is the argument for having the state handle marijuana like they handle alcohol. Notice in Vermont, as compared to other states, Vermont, the only place you can buy alcohol is at a state liquor store. Or a licensed agent, to be a state liquor store. Right.
You can get beer and wine at a number of places, but when it comes to spirits like vodka or
whiskey or what, So, you could easily see the state stores selling, Vermont marijuana smalls or whatever. And you know exactly the THC content. You're getting standardized stuff, so the stuff isn't being laced with fentanyl or any other crud that shouldn't be there. Certainly if it's Vermont brand, it could be 100% natural, artisanal.
Artisanal marijuana and organic, non-GMO.
Yes.
Pot.
And so you regulate it, you tax it, and you control where it's sold. So just like Joe high school student can't go into the state store and buy a bottle of vodka unless they can prove that they're 21 years old, and they're still carting people into their 40s to make sure that they're of age. It would be the same thing for marijuana. And, Massachusetts and Maine have legalized recreational use of marijuana without the caveats that Vermont has. Like Vermont, it's only you can have 1 ounce on you. Anything more, and you consider dealing. But it doesn't specify how you get that 1 ounce of dope.
Yeah, that is the kind of tricky part.
So and you can't go to the dispensaries that they're currently there for medical use and buy it. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, those folks in Massachusetts and Maine are getting ready to open up retail stores.
Right.
And and the argument is Vermont might be missing a bit of a beat because our neighbors will be selling dope and people will be going there. And the biggest neighbor of all, Canada, they're about to make it legalized nationwide in the coming weeks.
Right.
Now, granted, you're not going to be able to bring back some Quebec gold back into the United States because, of course, the Border Patrol folks consider it illegal.
Right, because they're federal.
So, pro tip, do not bring back your Canadian dope back home with you.
No, even if it's only an ounce, don't bring it.
No.
Well, that is a good point, that with, I think, a lot of focus when it comes to talking about taxing and regulating marijuana, a lot of the focus has been on the taxing part and how much money it could make the state, or how it could be an economic driver. Especially, there's been a lot of discussion of how it could help the agricultural business, another crop that farmers could grow. However, you pointed out really well that side about regulation, that you can regulate how much is it TCH? I always forget.
THC.
Thank you. Acronyms and dyslexia, not a good combination.
But you can regulate the strength of it and what's the ingredients in it. Definitely a good thing with edibles.
Yeah.
Since not everybody smokes the stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and you get to regulate where it was sold.
Yeah.
And that you can actually get a lot of control with a regulated system,
which we already have in place for hard liquor. Mm-hmm. So that I don't think it's not that much of a leap. And if for the prevention organizations, I think their job is pretty much the same. These things, these mind-altering substances, be it beer or be it marijuana, they're out there, but they're for adults. Mm-hmm. And please refrain from using this stuff until you're of age.
Right. So, quick change in topic, because we only have about a minute before I have to let you go. I want to touch in quickly about the campaign. I just had Christine Hallquist on the show, gubernatorial candidate. What else is the campaign shaping up to be so far for you, Randy?
Well, I was talking to Tim Ash, the Senate President Pro Tem, yesterday before the Solar Palooza down at the Wyndham Solid Waste. And he can't remember a campaign that's been so quiet. And, of course, we know the reason why it's been so quiet, because of the certain orange dude down in Washington and his daily atrocities that kind of suck all the air out of the political system.
Yeah.
And we can't help but be focused on what's happening in Washington and all the various repulsive things going on. And people forget, hey, someone's running for governor?
Right.
I mean, you don't see the lawn signs. You don't see very many bumper stickers. There's not a Democratic or Republican Party office anywhere. Mm-hmm. The candidates haven't been terribly visible either. And it's kind of, everyone's kind of going through the motions of a campaign. I don't see, it's because of that focus on Trump. Mm-hmm. And so this makes it a difficult election year to read.
Right. And a lot of people are focused on the midterms because they're focused on the Congress itself and changing power there, but we forget that we still have local races that are equally important.
Well, also the fact that their federal races are non-races. You really think someone's going to beat Bernie Sanders or Peter Welch? If you really believe that, I'll take your money. Gladly.
Right. But our local races are really important.
They are,
and in some ways
mainly
more than the
because
federal.
of the prospect of a veto-proof majority in the legislature. Mm-hmm. That should there be another Phil Scott term, would be a way of checking his power. Mm-hmm. But the main thing that Tim Ash was talking about was trying to get used to the idea of it's different now for some reason, because it used to be with budgets, the ledge comes up with a set of numbers, the administration comes up with a set of numbers, and then they dash out what the final figure should be. Mm-hmm. Or the same with other legislation. Administration says A, ledge says B. We try to come up with something that's AB or something.
Right.
And where everyone's happy. And now the administration's kind of coming in and say A. That's it. A.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I think you'll be writing about this in the Commons.
Yes, I will be writing about Mr. Ash and writing about the solar panels, which were, even though it was an awful, gray, lousy day yesterday, those panels were still churning out 538 kilowatts of power.
Wow, that's amazing.
At least from looking at the meter on the side of the Wyndham Solid Waste. Mm-hmm. And there's some other things will be going on down there too that will, in conjunction with those panels, to generate more energy.
Well, I look forward to reading that article, and I look forward to talking to you this next Friday.
Yep.
Have a great weekend, Randy.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
That's Randy Holhut from the Commons. Here's your weather, and I will probably return very quickly at the end of the break. Have a great weekend, everyone.